What is required is a government with the power to carry on a tolerant, non-partisan, non-doctrinaire system of policy for a considerable time. We need 4 or 5 years of calm, resolute policy and administration to enable us, after all we have been through, to regather our inherent strength and allow our native qualities to shine forth and earn their reward.
Those were Mr. Churchill's words at Liverpool on October the 2nd, setting the keynote for the opening of the Conservative election campaign. Parliament had not yet been prorogued, the old House had still to meet again for a final look at itself, but the date of the general election had been fixed, and the proclamation of dissolution gave formal seal to the passing of a doomed body.
By the King, a proclamation for dissolving the present Parliament and declaring the calling of another. George Rex.
The election campaign immediately got off the mark. The bill posters began to cover the hoardings with slogans, while committee rooms, staffed by eager volunteers, hummed with activity. Mr. Anthony Eden had flown back by air from a brief holiday abroad as soon as the election was announced. He arrives with friends and supporters to hand in his nomination papers to the returning officer at Leamington. Mr. R.A. Butler, on emerging from nomination, runs into a crowd of young opponents. There's an exchange of pamphlets accompanied by general good humour. The £150 in cash which candidates have to hand in as deposit is flourished by Colonel Ropner on his way to nomination. 3 weeks of hard work and strenuous electioneering by candidates up and down the country culminated in polling day. October the 25th was the date. It dawned foggy and slightly chill. Early polling was slow, as was to be expected of such a morning, but that was no indication of what was to come. Since cars were still limited to a ratio of the electorate, the horse-drawn vehicle made its appearance again, but not very often, and not really as a serious means of transport. It was generally agreed to be a quiet, rather orthodox election. The electors of the country fully intended to go to the poll, but everybody in his own good time. Here at Lambeth, we get a look inside the polling station. Ballot papers stamped and handed out, the voter in the polling booth. The ballot being secret, and that can't be too often repeated, we shan't reveal this voter's identity. Then into the ballot box. Outside, the party tellers accept the poll cards of people who have voted, but of course there's no telling how they've voted. Now the poll is closed and the ballot boxes are assembled at one central hall for the count. More secrecy surrounds this operation as the counting assistants perform their responsible job. Meanwhile, in London, crowds have gathered to see the early results shown in Trafalgar Square. First result, Watford, no change. In fact, the first 38 declarations recorded no change. Then Blakely, Manchester came through, Conservative gain, and the hopes which Conservatives had fostered began to assume reality. The mounting totals displayed in Piccadilly Circus also attracted huge crowds. As expected, the overnight score proved the Socialists in the lead, but Conservative gains had been sufficient to make the Socialist government's position very precarious. Sitters up in the dark hours of early morning counted 178 Labour seats, 145 Conservative, and these were the figures with which the next day started. The newspapers were prepared for another terrific day of sales as they brought out edition after edition giving latest results. It was no surprise to those with the course of the 1950 election in mind when Conservatives began to overhaul Socialists on the second day. At the Royal Exchange in the City of London, they clocked the advance. Tories now in the lead. Lord Woolton at Central Office followed the course of the polling with easily understood satisfaction. Radios, of course, were active everywhere. They told a tale of slow but steady Conservative improvement. The gains grew to 20, sufficient to unseat the Socialist government and to give the Conservatives a working majority. At Woodford, Mr. Mayor, the returning officer, gave the name of the victorious candidate and new Prime Minister.
Winston Spencer Churchill.
And in the moment of victory, Mr. Churchill spoke wise words of conciliation.
We all felt that we have a great deal in common, and now perhaps there may be a lull in our party strife which will enable us to understand more of what is good in our opponents and not to be so very clever at finding out all their shortcomings. And I wish you all, whatever party you belong, good fortune for yourselves and for our island home.
That was the spirit in which he took office again as Prime Minister and set about the task of forming his cabinet, with Mr. Eden, of course, as Foreign Secretary. And Mr. Harold Macmillan named as Minister of Housing and Local Government to emphasize the importance attached by the new government to house building. Captain Cruikshank, Minister of Health, was appointed to lead the House of Commons. Sir Walter Monckton, Minister of Labour, found a host of manpower problems on his plate, while Mr. R.A. Butler, as Chancellor, assumed the unenviable task of saving the nation from financial ruin. All these cabinet ministers inherited a situation requiring the most urgent and determined handling. Now was a time when action had to come without the usual publicity, but the public was aware that there was action being taken. Mr. Littleton flew at once to Malaya to decide on immediate measures to tackle the bandit problem. Mr. Churchill and Mr. Eden went to Paris to see the French Premier and his colleagues. This was to convey personal assurances of the British government's understanding of France's viewpoint on European unity, especially in the matter of defence. Mr. Eden described his approach to the problems of foreign policy in this way.
We want our relations with all peoples to be based on consent and free understanding. And we believe that we have the experience to make this ideal a reality.
The conciliatory attitude which animated the new government was allied to a certainty of what they wanted to achieve. The two statesmen set off again almost immediately to establish a more cordial basis of cooperation with the United States. Truly, the election had proved a turning point. Firm hands were at the helm again. Mr. Churchill was back on the bridge.